Good afternoon. This is Regine with the Transmission of Awakening channel, and today I'm here with Francis Bennett. Francis was a Catholic Trappist monk, and he's also been in the Buddhist tradition as well.
Yep.
And he was also involved with pastoral care, like the hospital chaplain for the sick and dying in hospices. So I am thrilled to talk to Francis today about his path and his journey, and I am looking forward to learning a lot about you and what you wish to share with the world. So, welcome, Francis. How are you today?
Good. How are you, Regine?
I'm doing really good. I hope my introduction was okay.
Fine.
Was
Yeah.
that good? Okay.
Perfect.
Well, I'd like to start with your Trappist monk background. How did you get started with
Well, hmm. I actually was told about a writer who was a Trappist called Thomas Merton. When I was a young man in high school, one of my high school teachers got me interested in reading The Seven-Story Mountain, which is the autobiography of Merton, and it really fascinated me. And I went down to Gethsemane. I was only probably 18 years old, 17 maybe even, and went down there, and I just kind of fell in love with the idea of becoming a monk and giving my whole life to seeking God and a spiritual life, which was what really was interesting to me. It was kind of the most compelling thing to me, even as a young man. And so I went down there a number of times. I ended up, I asked if I could enter, and they said, well, you have to be um, a little older. So they wanted me to wait till I was 21 or so, at least. And so I went to college. I went to actually a seminary college and studied philosophy. And then at the age of 22, I entered the monastery at Gethsemane in 1981.
that? So why were you interested in the spiritual life, especially as a young boy? Like what drew you to it?
I don't know. I just had a real hunger for God. I really felt very early in life that the whole reason we're here on the planet was to come to a sense of union with God, to experience God's presence in our lives, and that was very compelling to me. And that was kind of my my reason for being in a way at a very pretty early age. And so that just seemed to make the most sense to me. To become a monk seemed to be the way of life that made the most sense to me out of all the things I saw. So I know it's a little out of the ordinary. It's not what most young guys want to do, but that's what I wanted to do, so that's what I did.
Well, that's interesting. Do you believe in reincarnation? Do you think maybe you had past lives as a monk or something like that?
Yeah, I do believe in past life. I have a sense that I've been around before, and probably a monk, and probably a monk in different traditions even, because I resonate a lot with different. When I was just a young boy, I resonated a lot with Buddhism, and I didn't really know anything about it, but I just naturally was attracted to a lot of things in it. And then when I was exposed to the Buddhist path through Vipassana, well, first through Zen. I did when I was in the monastery. I did study of Zen with some couple Zen masters, and then later I got involved in Vipassana meditation, which is the primary practice that is encouraged in Theravadan Buddhism, the way of the elders. They call it Theravadan. Vadan is way, Thera is elder. So, and that's the Buddhism that's mostly prevalent in Southeast Asia, in Burma, Thailand, Sri Lanka, some in Vietnam, and I got very involved in that form of meditation. It actually goes back to the oldest extant teaching of the Buddha from based on the Pali Canon. And that when I was exposed to that, I remember it felt very familiar to me. It felt like I knew it before. I'd hear teachings like the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, dependent origination, all these teachings of Buddhism, and they just automatically just stuck in my mind. I'd hear them once and I'd remember them, and I really feel that it was because of previous lives. Although I don't really talk a lot about that because it is a belief system, and it's not really necessary that somebody believe in that in order to wake up. So some people believe in it, some people don't. Like
Yeah,
any,
well, I've met other Catholic priests who didn't believe in it. So,
yeah, a lot of
yeah.
people don't, and that's fine. People believe what they believe.
So that's interesting. So, do you think there are similarities between the two traditions, Catholic monasticism and Buddhist monasticism.
Monasticism?
Monasticism, yeah. Mhm.
Yeah. Well, sure. I mean, when I was in the Trappist, we sometimes would have, especially Tibetan monks, come. We had a lot of interreligious dialogue with Tibetan monks, and I remember one point some came and stayed with us for a period of time, and also when I was in a monastery in South Carolina, some Tibetan monks came and stayed with us, and I remember we got together and talked with them, and we had a lot of the same kind of issues that monks everywhere have, like concern about silence. That was one. That's kind of a perennial concern of monks, that they have a silent atmosphere and that that kind of thing. Um, I mean, the practices and culture are different, but the basic impetus of monastic life is to really focus the whole life on the spiritual search. So that's really a common ground that all monks from all the different traditions seem to have. So I
Mm.
would say there's similarities.
Yeah. So, what was it like to be a Trappist monk?
Well, it was like living your life, and I live my life in a monastery, so the whole monastic life is set up to facilitate an experience of God or a realization of God's presence, and to live your whole life in the presence of God, which we do anyway, really. I mean, whether we know it or not. But in a monastic life, the whole idea is to kind of come to a conscious awareness of that presence, and so the whole life is set up to help facilitate that, to help encourage that. So it's lived in silence a lot of the time. Um, the day is punctuated by times of coming together for prayer, and there's a lot of spiritual reading that's encouraged. We call it Lectio Divina, which is holy reading or reading of scriptures, reading of mystical texts, things like that, in a prayerful kind of contemplative manner. Centering prayer is a form of contemplative prayer that was developed by the Trappists in the late 60s, early 70s, and still to this day, there's a contemplative outreach is a big organization headed up, at least spiritually, by Father Thomas Keating, who's a Trappist monk in Snowmass,
Mhm.
and they go around teaching a contemplative practice called centering prayer, which is a kind of non-conceptual contemplative prayer form that I was trained in also as a young monk, and I've taught, and I still actually teach it as a practice for students. I have people that come to me and want to delve into all this a little more deeply. It's a
Yeah.
good basic practice.
Yeah. I've been to retreat centers that were centered on the monastic tradition, and I could feel the silence there. It's very palpable.
Hmm.
Yeah, there's like a sweetness to it. Like I always feel like full of joy when I'm there for whatever reason. I don't know.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, it's a great life. I mean, I didn't leave the monastery because I was unhappy. I was very happy as a monk, but it felt like it was time to leave and go out into the world and share some things. So that's what I did a couple years ago now. It's almost 2 years ago.
Oh wow, so that's pretty recently that you left.
Yep.
Wow. So how is it? How is it like being in the world now?
Well, there's an adjustment, a learning curve, kind of an adjustment period. But I mean, I kind of roll with the punches, and think I'm doing okay. And
Really?
I'm getting
Yeah.
more and more opportunities to share and do retreats and events and talks, and I Skype with people a lot. So my work is sharing this path with people and um, trying to assist them and accompany them on their path and be a kind of a mentor or a guide or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah. So it says on your website that your the spiritual teaching is God is in everything, and everything is in God.
Yeah, it's a little kind of phrase I came up with that it's on my website. Yeah, it's in my book too. It's mentioned in my that phrase.
Yes.
That was sort of basically in a very simple way it articulates the what realization I had that the very being, the sense of sentience in me is itself the presence of God, and that presence is actually in everything that exists. It holds everything that exists in being. In fact, it's the beingness of everything, you could say. And so God is in everything, everything is in God is a kind of simple way of sort of putting that. So
Yes, and your
that's,
book is called I Am That I Am.
I am that I am.
Yeah, can you talk a little bit about that without giving it away, of course?
Well, yeah, it's I didn't set out really to write a book. I had this shift of perception, you could say, when I was in the monastery in 2010, in the middle of a church service, and it was very life changing, very transforming for me. And my spiritual director was very aware at the time that this was a really big shift for me, and it kind of changed my whole way of perceiving reality and God, myself, other people, life, just you name it. And at first, I found it very hard to articulate and speak about it. Just really, it seemed so ineffable and beyond words, and I couldn't really put it into words too well, except just that I woke up to the fact that God is always present eternally. And it didn't seem to go away. It just seemed to, that realization came, and it just, the realization itself, the very essence of it is that God is eternally present. So therefore, that was the experience as well that came from the realization. And so he encouraged me to start writing journals. So I started writing about my experience, what had happened to me, and how I sort of saw it and how I was interpreting it. And at the end of a year or so, he thought that, and I thought as well, I was the one that kind of thought of it at first. And I said, what do you think? I've written all this stuff. And he looked at it and he thought, yeah, I think there's a book here. So it kind of morphed into a book. I just presented it as a possible subject for publishing to Non-Duality Press in England, and they were interested in it, so it got published, and that's how it came about. And I'm writing another book now, actually, for them.
Oh, congratulations. Do you have a name for it yet?
I don't really have a name for it yet. Something about fully human, fully divine, and it's going to be focused on Jesus as a kind of symbol of awakening and enlightenment, a kind of Western archetype of the awakened person that's fully human. On one level, we never really lose our humanity, and yet fully divine. So there's a kind of awakening to the transcendent, absolute quality of divinity, of presence, the sacred presence that's at the core of all of our being. And yet, within that sacred presence, there is arising and ceasing this human dimension, this human vulnerability, human experiences that we all have. We're all pretty conscious of those. The problem with it is that most people think that's all they are. All they are is this body and mind and this human person with a name, a form, a personality, a history, a role, relationships, all that. And those things are still relatively important. But when you awaken to this absolute level, you realize I'm not only that. I'm not exclusively just that human quality. Um, that who I am essentially is this divinity, this sacred presence. And that's not to negate the human. It's still there. It still needs to be acknowledged. It still needs to be lived out in the world. We all have roles, relationships, functions, personalities,
Mm-hmm.
various kinds. And there's nothing wrong with that as long as we understand that who we really are transcends that. We're not merely relegated to that. We're something much bigger. We're that in which that appears, you could say.
So how do we do that? How do we live like that in practical life? Like say you're in traffic and someone cuts you off, or like you said, did you say you were married? You have a wife?
No, no.
Oh, okay. Like
No,
let's
I was
say,
in the monastery
oh, okay.
till 2 years ago, so
Oh, okay. I was like,
not
wow.
yet. Nothing, nothing's developed that way
You
yet.
never know.
You never know. But
but but yeah, you in a relationship and or you going through financial struggles, yes, it's good to remember that we're, like you said, the sacredness and the divinity, but how do you do that in your
well, you
life?
don't do it. I mean, you are that already. It's a matter of waking up to it, of really coming to a realization. Some people call it self-realization. Some people would call it God realization. Uh, Whatever you call it, it's something that we have to just wake up to. It's something that we discover that's revealed to us. Um, it's not really something we do so much. Even spiritual practice that leads to such an awakening is not, I often say it's not really a doing, it's more of a being. Because what you're really, all spiritual practices that point to this kind of awakening and realization are essentially a kind of sinking back into the sense of just being here and now, being present. You know, contemplative prayer does that. We're looking at, in contemplative prayer, the kind that I've taught mostly, it's a matter of sort of gazing at the presence of God in your own heart. Maybe in faith at first, it's a belief. But then if you do that enough and just rest in that sense of presence, which is not really separate from your own simple presence, your own sentience here in this moment, when you rest in that enough, eventually you kind of see it. Often in a split second, you see, oh, this sense of presence that I am at the core of my being is always present. Of course it is. How can you not be present? You're always present, aren't you? So the realization of that is that sort of self-realization. And there's different depths of that. I mean, people can see that very, very deeply and profoundly to a point where it's very stable and constant and never leaves them again. That consciousness never again seems to fade away or come and go. Or people can get a glimpse of that, and then it can maybe seem to come and go back and forth, and they'll be in that mode for a while, where they'll have a sense of presence, they'll have a sense of conscious awareness, um, of conscious awareness, and then it will recede, and they'll get back into a more kind of typical day-to-day mentality of wanting this and not wanting that, and, you know, the typical kind of human sort of rat race, you could say. But you know, that's the essential awakening in a nutshell. But like I say, there's different depths of that. There's different depths of clarity of that.
Do you think meditation and other spiritual practices can help facilitate that awakeness and
Yeah,
presence?
absolutely, absolutely. I'm not one of these people who thinks you just sit around, it's going to hit you one fine day. That's that's normally not how it works. I mean, you can't say never. You can never say never. There are some people that just, you know, after having done no spiritual practice, at least that they know of in this lifetime, they suddenly wake up at a very young age. You know, they'll just wake up. Ramana Maharshi was somebody like that, just laid down in his uncle's study and pretended he was dead, or kind of simulated the idea of dying, and woke up at the age of 15 in a very profound and deep and stable, abiding way, and then stayed in that consciousness the rest of his life and taught and shared that with people. But that's rare. I mean, that's not the normal thing. I think most people do actually require a good deal of spiritual practice that's very focused and dedicated and disciplined, and usually working with some kind of spiritual guide who can point out to them the pitfalls when they get off the track, what they need to do to get back on the track, to just kind of accompany them and help them on their path. And most people absolutely need that. That's not to say that that creates awakening. Awakening, this consciousness, this presence, is always already present. I mean, it's who we are at the core of our being. So it's not like we acquire something new from outside, but it's more like we uncover something that's already there. It's almost as if you have a beautiful, beautiful diamond, like the Hope Diamond, some beautiful gem that's radiant in its beauty and quality and just absolutely, you know, lovely and beautiful. And yet it's covered over and caked over by layers and layers of mud, let's say. So you couldn't really appreciate it. But if you take something and wash the mud off, then the diamond's revealed. The diamond was already always there in all its beauty, but it was covered over. It's the same with our true nature as people, what I would call children of God. We're all born the children of God, beloved, infinitely loved, you know, full of grace and truth, radiant with God's presence at the core of our being. But it's covered over by all the conditioning, all the anger, the worry, the fear, the constant thinking about life, the constant manipulating of people, places, and things to come out on our own terms. And so we miss this presence. We're distracted from it somehow. And this is the sort of perennial human condition and human problem, you know, in different traditions. In the Hindu and the Buddhist tradition, they call it Maya, illusion or ignorance. In Christianity, they call it original sin, you know. But it's really, in other words, it's essentially saying there's some quality about the way we live our lives that distracts us from this essential core of our being, which I would call the presence of God. or you could just call presence if you like. There's something that distracts us from that. And the spiritual path is just about learning practices that help us let go of the conditioning, the distractions, the things that cover over this beautiful, radiant self that we are.
Hmm.
So,
Yeah, I've
does that
spoken
make
to
sense?
that absolutely, and that was a beautiful analogy with the diamond. With the diamond, the analogy, that it's beautiful and it's radiant, but it's covered with mud. And also, I've spoken with, other teachers and healers who said that prior to that awakening experience, they had like a dying, like a metaphorical death of some sort. So do you think
Yeah.
it's like the death, the conditioning that you're thinking about, that you're
I don't think
it's
conditioning really completely dies. I mean, there's a lot of talk
okay.
about ego death and that
Hmm.
kind of thing, and they almost talk about it as if there's a kind of complete obliteration of
Right,
a personal sense of self
right.
or any kind of individuality. And I think it's more of a. I don't think that's quite the full journey. That might be a
Mm-hmm.
stage in the journey, but I think really what you come to realize after a while is that there is still some conditioning that's always going to remain as long as there's a human body. There's going to be a personality, there's going to be preferences,
Mm-hmm.
there's going to be a bit of ego, not in a kind of big damaging sort of a complete self-centered ego, but ego in the sense of a personal, individual sense of self that is functional in the world. But awakening, I think, helps us see beyond that. We transcend that. We see that I'm not merely that little me. I'm not merely Francis with this body and mind and personality and history and role and relationship with other people and so on. That's not who I am essentially. Who I am essentially is this presence. But this Francis person is arising in this presence. So he's included. He's included. He's not who I am exclusively. Who I am essentially at the core is this presence, and that's who you are, and that's who everyone is. But it's manifesting in the world right now in the form of Regine and Francis and Mark and John and Mary and Susie and all these different forms, or a tree or a cat or a dog or a porpoise or a giraffe or any number of all the things that are so wonderful and so beautiful that we see all around us. Those are like, in a certain sense, you could say those are incarnations of God. They're this
Mm-hmm.
God consciousness, this presence manifesting in the world, in the world of form, in the phenomenal world. So a lot of people get into non-dual spirituality in a kind of philosophical way, and they think, well, all there is consciousness, and they have it as like almost a belief, and then they get into a very dualistic mindset because they say, well, all that's real is this absolute consciousness, and all this
Mm-hmm.
other stuff is just passing
Right.
garbage. It doesn't matter at all. It's like, well, no, it's sacred also because it's actually a divine incarnation. It's God manifesting in form. And in the Zen tradition, in the Heart Sutra, they talk about form is emptiness, emptiness is form. Form is
Mm-hmm.
none other than emptiness, emptiness is none other than form. So that they're not really two separate things, they're just different aspects of the one reality of God or presence or consciousness or whatever word you want to assign.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but
Mm-hmm.
the cutting edge of my own unfolding and what I really teach and what I share with people is that we have to come to a sense of integration of these seeming, the absolute, the relative, the personal, the impersonal, the reality that we call God or consciousness or whatever. It transcends those polar, opposites. It's beyond personal and impersonal. It's beyond absolute and relative. It's beyond good and bad. It's beyond all the lists of opposites. You know,
Yeah, I was going to ask
transcends.
you about that, because people say, well, all is God. Well, what about evil? What about the horrible things that happen in the world?
Well, I mean, there are things that happen that cause pain, that cause suffering. Um, is suffering though ultimately really caused by what happens to us, or is it caused by our relationship to what happens to us? That's a question. That was a question that the Buddha
Hmm.
asked, and I think all great spiritual seekers have asked down through the centuries. and often they seem to come up with very similar answers, although they might use different words, different kind of ideas, but they're essentially saying that if we're just present and we're just being present means acceptance, means complete presence, complete openness. I sometimes even call this presence or this consciousness openness, because it's just unconditional openness to whatever arises, whatever is. When we harm other people, often we're just acting out of our own ignorance. On some strange level, we have this idea that if I do this thing, even though it's harmful to myself or somebody else, it's somehow going to bring me happiness. So we're mistaken about what direction to look for happiness in, and so we look for it in ways that are maybe harmful to ourselves, to others, to both. But it's not. We're kind of hardwired to want happiness. It's innate in it. We actually are happiness, but we need to discover that. We're not going to find it in outward things. We're not going to find it in situations. We're not going to find it in scads of money or fame or all the things that people usually think bring happiness. But happiness is really our true nature. Does that make sense? So
Yeah.
a lot of what we think of as evil in the world are things that cause pain or suffering to others. They're really a misguidedness that human beings have, you know, that they think, oh, if we fight this war with this country, then we'll get their natural resources and we'll be happier as a nation. Or if I rob this bank, um, I'll be happier because I'll have more money and then I can get what I want. Or it goes on and on and on, you know. Some people are very unskillful in trying to find happiness. It's always been right inside of them, and yet they're looking for it out there in some other person, place, or thing. And sometimes they do kind of harmful things to manipulate the outside world to bring them the happiness or the causes of happiness that they think will work for them.
Well, why doesn't God stop them? I mean, so is there free will then? Is that what you're saying? What do you think about free will and destiny?
I'm not going to even answer that. I don't think it's really worth even. It's such a complex subject, and
Well, a lot of people have questions, especially people on a spiritual
yeah,
path.
but you know,
They always
questions
wondering.
aren't always so good. I mean, I think there's something to be said for just saying sometimes we don't know. You know, I mean, there are answers to those things, but I think that until a certain point, I mean, when a person gets to a point where they realize that who they really are is this presence, who they really are at the very core of their being is the presence of God, then there's no sense of there being any other will but God's will. If God is all there is, then the only will that really exists is God's. Um, but in our limited human understanding, we can't quite comprehend that. You know, why does God, for example, and this is the perennial question of why, you know, why do bad things happen to good people, that kind of thing.
Right.
And having been a chaplain in a hospital and in a hospice, I dealt with death a lot. And that's a perennial question that everybody has. And you know what? Like a lot of perennial deep questions like that, there's really not an answer to it that really satisfies the human intellect. Because like when I remember dealing with a situation where there was a little girl, there was a father and a son that were at the hospital I worked at, and then there was a mother and a little girl at another hospital. They were a family that had been in an accident. And the chaplain from the other hospital, which was a children's hospital, calls me and says, the little girl has died. So I had to go out and tell the father that the little girl had died. Now, a lot of people would see a situation like that. They'd say, why would God allow that? And there's just no answer to that. I mean, if we believe that God is infinite intelligence and consciousness, then we know, if we know that, especially if we really see that directly, I'm not just a belief, but if we know it because we see it directly, then we can trust the unfolding of life, even when it unfolds in ways that make no sense to us from a human perspective of justice and so on. You know, horrible things happen every day. But we can't know the rhyme or reason of that. Now, that doesn't mean also, that's often misunderstood. Well, if everything happens the way it should, then you just live this passive life and let the whole world kind of go to hell in a handbasket, or, you know, you don't do anything to change anything. And I'm not saying that. Maybe part of the reason why something is permitted to happen is precisely because it inspires people to do something to change the situation, to help, you know, help feed the people, help come and assist the people that have been in an earthquake or, a tidal wave, a tsunami, or whatever. Sometimes when horrible things like that happen, we see people rush in compassion and kindness to respond to that. And maybe all of it, I mean, there is a kind of place people can get to in a sense of deep realization where they really come to a point of absolute surrender and trust, that they really understand by their own direct experience that everything unfolds as it should. But again, that doesn't mean we don't do something to respond to pain, to respond to suffering, to do what we can do to help ease that. It doesn't mean that at all. It just means there's a ground of acceptance. There's a kind of ground, a foundation of basic acceptance. So we accept, okay, right now this person is starving. Right now this person is dying, or this person is being tortured, or whatever. But, I'm not going to just sit back and say, oh, well, that's meant to happen. Well, that's happening, but maybe I can do something. Maybe I can feed them. Maybe I can dispel their oppressor and say, stop. Don't keep doing this.
Yeah.
And by all means, do that.
Yeah,
I would never.
I was in a spiritual community where people would actually say, well, that's their karma.
No, that's a very unskillful sort of misunderstanding of the idea of karma. It's if that's their karma, then it's if you're there and they're sitting in front of you and they're starving, then your karma is to help feed them if you can, or do something to respond to that, because that's what's in front of you. So clearly that's what's meant for you to engage, So it's not an either or thing. Again, it's that's the essence of spiritual maturity, is to see that reality is not normally an either or prospect. It's both and, On one level, we can accept that, yes, this is what's happening right now. This really painful thing, this experience that's causing suffering to this person. That's what's happening right now. But what can I do to help? What can I do to respond to that? And those are not contradictory at all. Like I say, there's a foundation of acceptance, and then you act out of that surrender. And often when you accept what is, you actually have a much more calm sort of mind, and you're able to be inspired more skillfully about how to respond to that situation. So surrender and acceptance of what is a groundwork that can bring a calmness of spirit and a calmness of heart and mind that makes possible the clarity of the self can then come forth and respond very, very effectively and skillfully in situations. Does that make sense?
Perfectly, yeah. How can we be okay with not knowing or accept
Pardon
not
me?
knowing? How can we accept not knowing? Like you were saying, like when bad things happen, and sometimes the answer is I don't know, but it's sometimes, like you said, it's hard for us as human beings to accept not knowing. So how can
Yeah,
we do that?
just do it. Just try it. And just how do you learn? How do you play tennis? How do you play
Practice.
the piano?
Hmm.
Yeah,
Practice.
so just try to let go. Just do the best you can to be okay with not knowing. A lot of that's based on illusion, because it's the idea that I should know. I should be
Hmm.
able to figure everything out. I should be in control of life. Well,
Hmm.
maybe you should, but you're not, are you? I mean, the reality is that we're human. We're vulnerable human beings. We have these. That's one thing I learned working in a hospital and working in a hospice, seeing people die every day, and you realize how vulnerable and just you know, very weak these bodies are. They're so susceptible to disease, to accident, and one little thing can go wrong. Like, somebody's potassium level can be off and they can die. They can go into cardiac arrest or something and die, or, things can just happen at the drop of a hat. And we're all, this phenomenal world is so fleeting and so ephemeral, and it's very passing.
Hmm.
So anything can happen at any time.
So yeah, I wanna thank you for answering my question in advance. I was gonna ask you a little bit more about your experience as a hospital chaplain and working with terminally ill patients. So a two-part question. So really, what was that like for you? And also, how did you counsel the families and help them through this?
Well, I mean, each situation is different, and each person is different, and each family is different, and their response to something like that is different, and it depends on so many different things, and that's really true with spiritual sharing with people too. Each person is different. There's no
Mm-hmm.
one teaching that you can give everybody. You just can't. I mean, it's like if you were a doctor, you wouldn't just give out the same medicine to everybody that came to you, would you? You give out one kind of medicine for one disease and you give out another kind for another. And that's the way a good spiritual teacher has to be. They have to understand, they have to have a really kind of vast overview of the whole spiritual territory and have
Mm-hmm.
experienced it themselves. And they understand the nuances and the subtlety of it. And they understand that, there's not one size fits all. It's different things people react differently to different things. They resonate with different things, different practices, different religions even. The Dalai Lama even said, Christianity teaches a personal God, the idea of a relationship with a personal God, and Buddhism doesn't teach that. But even the Dalai Lama said, but some people are better off maybe because of previous lives where they were way into emptiness and maybe got a little cold and didn't have a real open heart, and maybe they need a real personal kind of deity to relate to that will somehow awaken their heart and open their heart of kindness and compassion. Or
Mm-hmm.
maybe somebody has been too involved and wrapped up in other people and things, and they need that sense of emptiness. And so there's not one thing fits all. And the same with ministry to the dying. They're all at different places in their journey. Some people are really at a place of acceptance. Some people fight it to the last breath, you
Mm-hmm.
know, and we all are on our different paths and we experience things differently. But I think a lot of what the essential element of ministry to the dying, to people who are going through that experience on that journey, um, is to just be present. The essence of this realization that I've had and that I understand and see and realize and live in and abide in is presence. That's, if you had to put it into one word, you could just say presence, and that says it. And so when you're living in that consciousness, then you live presence 24/7. You're always present. There's always a conscious presence.
Mm-hmm.
And the best gift you can give to somebody who's going through a difficult situation, whether it's a terminal diagnosis or financial ruin or a relationship problem, or we all have friends and family and people that are going through all kinds of things, is to just be present to them and to be present in that vast space of openness, so that whatever they're bringing to the table, whatever suffering, whatever pain, whatever heartache, whatever anxiety, if you just embrace that with your presence, if you just allow that to be with that, to be with them, that can be transforming, even if you don't say a word. It can
Yeah.
create a space of
Mm-hmm.
acceptance. It can create a space of surrender. It can
Mm-hmm.
actually bring someone. It can be like a transmission of the spirit of surrender, which is the essential quality of this consciousness that's utterly open and unconditionally open and present to whatever is. That is surrender, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And so if somebody's abiding in this presence, then they're a walking transmission of this surrender. So even just being present to a person who's going through difficulty can be a help, can be a blessing for that person. So I
Yeah.
would the
I
essential.
yeah, I had that experience personally with a Catholic priest who just sat with me one day when I was experiencing, some turmoil. And it's true. I just felt really loved unconditionally in that moment and
Yeah.
really accepted.
Well, because the
Mm-hmm.
person who's doing that, who lives in that and abides in that and brings that into the world, they are a light in the world. They are a vehicle for the presence of God. That's
Mm-hmm.
the calling of you and for me. It's for all of us, is to be the presence of God in the world, in a
Mm-hmm.
world where people are often unaware of it. People are
Mm-hmm.
often completely unaware of it, and yet that presence is in their very heart
Mm-hmm.
and they don't see it. So when you are consciously aware of it, you can radiate that presence in the world. That's the whole purpose of being here. And for me, that's symbolized in the Christ. I would say that's the indwelling Christ, or Christ shining through me, Christ living in me, but Christ is just a symbol of that for me. It's a symbol that I relate to, but you don't have to relate to that. If you relate to Buddha, you could call it Buddha nature, or you could
Mhm.
call it nothing at all. It doesn't matter. It doesn't care what you call
Mhm.
it. So
Yeah. Well, I've heard of stories from nurses and hospital workers and even relatives who've been in the presence, of the dying, and they said that they saw like their soul leave, or they saw like an actual change happen right
yeah.
before the person passed. Have you ever experienced that? Is that like a common thing that happens, like before someone is about to go?
Yeah, I've had all kinds of odd experiences in my life. I
Mm-hmm.
don't usually talk a lot about them just because then you get people having all kinds of ideas about experiences, and then they want experiences and they want to see lights and they want to see souls leaving the body and so on and so forth, or whatever you
Mm-hmm.
claim to have experienced or think you experienced or did experience. And
Mm-hmm.
this is not really about experience. It's actually about discovering the ground of all experience. It's discovering that in which every experience arises and ceases. That's what realization really is. That's that presence of God. That's how God, everything is in God and God is in everything.
Mm-hmm.
And every experience that comes and goes, whether it's the most mundane experience of taking out the garbage or it's a mystical vision that leaves you in ecstasy, it's going to come and it's going to go.
Mm-hmm.
It's not really the important thing. It's this presence is who you really are on the deepest level,
Hmm. So do
and
you
that's
see
what's
that till the very end with people who are dying?
pardon me.
That presence that you're talking about.
Uh,
I guess my question is it palpable even when people are dying? Can you see that?
oh, sure it is. It's present.
Mm.
This presence is the presence that permeates all that is, including a dead body. It's not even I mean it's not
Mm.
it's not essentially confined to any personal reality. I mean, personal realities arise and cease in it, but it's never confined to that person. It's
Mm.
that person is just a manifestation of that presence, just like that rock is, just like that tree is, just like that cat or dog is, or you know.
Mm-hmm. Do you believe we have a soul and that animals and plants and everything has a soul?
I mean, what does it really matter what I believe? I mean, we all believe many things. I can
Mm-hmm.
believe this, I can believe that, I can believe I'm Napoleon, or I can believe that I'm, whatever. You can believe
Mm-hmm.
anything you want. Um,
Mm-hmm.
Sort of what my sense of what I need to be about in my sharing is to kind of point toward that
Mm-hmm.
which really is that people can directly know.
Mm-hmm.
We can talk about beliefs all day long, but the reality is that in like what happens after you die, for example, what do you believe
Mm-hmm.
what happens after you die, or do you believe animals still have some existence after? You can go on, and it's endless, all the things you can talk about what people believe. But until we know, we don't really know, do we? I mean, we can say I believe that this is the way it is, but you don't know it until you
Mm-hmm.
know it.
Right.
And
But
so
as
I
as
shy away. I shy away a bit from talking about a bunch of beliefs, or
okay.
experiences, or it's just it's so endless, and it's like anybody can believe anything, and people
Well,
do.
like in your spiritual counseling, if someone came up to you and said, hey, do we have a soul? Does our soul leave us when we die? I mean, what would you say to them?
Yeah, it depends on what you think of as a soul. It depends on a lot of things. I mean, those are not just yes and no questions.
Mm,
Those are very. First of all, you've got all the terminology of soul, spirit, mind, heart. But what does all those things mean? I mean, they mean different things to different people.
mm,
So if somebody comes up to me and says, "Do you believe we have a soul?" I'd first ask them, "Well, what do you mean by soul?" I mean, everybody has their own definitions of words. And a lot of times in spiritual scenes and movements, people have this assumption that everybody, when they say soul, they all mean the same thing and they all mean what I mean. Well, that's silly. They don't. They mean all
mm,
kinds of different things. And really, what words we say aren't really so important. The words just point to something. The reality is what's important, whether you call it a soul, a spirit, an essence, an Atman, a Christ within you, or whatever you want to
mm,
call it. You can
mm,
call things, all kinds. You can call realities all kinds of names,
And
but the name,
what is reality?
just what I'm trying to point to all the time, is this sense of presence. I mean, that's the ultimate reality. That's what all this manifestation is a manifestation of that. It's flowing out of that, you know.
Mm.
So that's the important thing, is to wake up to reality, to wake up to who we really are, um, not to ascribe to a set of beliefs, you know, not to like put your name, sign your signature at the end of a list of beliefs. I believe this, 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 and this. That's what a lot of traditional religion does. It says, well, you need to believe X, Y, and Z, and then you're a Christian or a Buddhist or a Jew or a Hindu or whatever. But you know, can we really know those things? I mean, that's the question, is like, we need to know reality, get to know who we are, and then we'll know a lot of things will be answered for us. And some things still won't be answered. But then we have to just accept, okay, I don't know. I'm fine not knowing.
Mm.
You know, I don't. And in reality, we can't figure all this out with our head, in our head, in some intellectual, notional way. We can't know all the mysteries of life, and you know, why does God allow this to happen, or questions like that. There's a lot of questions that there's really no answer to, or there might be a million different answers to. You know.
Right. Okay.
So I would say, when people have a lot of questions about what's true and what's real, and is there a soul, and is there a God, and why this, why that, why not this, you know, I would say, well, we'll investigate that. Look at that for yourself. Look at your own experience of those things and see what you find out. Because then you'll know from your own experience. That's what's important. It's not having a bunch of beliefs. It's not like reading a bunch of books and saying, oh, I like that belief, I think I'll pick that one. I like the idea that there's previous lives, so I think I'll just believe that, because that seems like a nice way to believe. Or that's because my friend believes that way, or Buddha believed that way, or Jesus did, so I will. Well, that's fine for Jesus and Buddha or your friend, but what about you? You know, you need to find out for yourself these things. And I can tell you what conclusions I've come to by investigating these things, and I've investigated these things pretty deeply my whole life. But it's there's no point in me telling you what conclusions I've come to. I can share with you this sense of presence, and I hopefully embody this presence in a way that you can feel it, that you can sort of intuit that yes, this presence is real, and it's in me too, and it's, you know, that's fine. That's like a kind of transmission of truth or reality. But you know, by investigating life, you know, we all come to know what we feel we know. But we all have to do that. Nobody can do it for you, you know. I can't do it and then tell you what I found out, and then you can just accept everything I tell you. You know, find out for yourself what it is. What if you want to know if there's a soul, find out. Look at it, like investigate that, and see what you learn. See what you find out from your own experience. That's what I would say. That's a better answer, I think, than just giving an answer. This is the way I see it. This is the way it is. You know.
Well, I was going to ask you about what do you think about, health practices, because you mentioned, that with your experience in the hospice, you saw a lot of like fragile bodies, and you realize how fragile we are.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I was going to ask you, what do you think, living a healthy lifestyle can help address
Oh,
some of these
sure.
issues?
That's important. I mean, to get exercise, to eat right, to follow guidelines for health. I mean, but in reality, I mean, there's a lot of various opinions about that, isn't there? So,
Yeah.
again, you have to investigate it for yourself. And even every body's different. I found out a couple years ago I have diabetes, and what I've discovered about that in experimenting and investigating it, looking at what my experience of eating is, and how I eat and what I eat and when I eat, and that's like, even for a diabetic, that's different for every diabetic. Some can eat a certain food that another can't eat, and it's all about how that particular body metabolizes that food, and how severe the diabetes is, and what their other health issues are. And there's all kinds of variance in that can make it very different from person to person. So while I think it's really important to focus on keeping your body healthy and and there are some basic things that most people agree on in terms of plenty of rest, plenty of fluid, you know, eating nutritious food. Now people will debate about that. Should I eat meat or should I not eat meat?
Right.
Should I eat all raw vegetables or should I cook I mean, there's endless opinions on this. So I think each person has to really look at it as best they can and investigate it. And also each person's body is different. So it's going to respond differently to different things. So we each have to figure out these things. There's no one answer to things like this again.
Yeah. Well, even among spiritual teachers, like there's this one spiritual master, I think she's from Vietnam or something, and she has a chain of like these vegan restaurants, and her whole thing is like not hurting animals. And she thinks vegetarianism is a higher path.
Mm-hmm.
But then I've heard some teachers say, well, it really doesn't matter, you know. So.
Well, and even the Buddha allowed for his monks to eat what was one of the rules of the monastic and Theravadan Buddhist monastic, which I ordained in for about a year or so. I did a temporary ordination in Theravadan monastic life, and one of the things in the Vinaya, the code of ethics for monks, is you eat what's offered to you. So if you go around with your begging bowl and people put in meat, then you eat it. It's not, so they're not, and yet also in the Vinaya is that the monks can't dig in the soil because they might hurt an insect, a worm or something. So there's things. It seems contradictory, but it's very subtle and complex. These kind of things. Everything in life is. It's not. People think there's one answer that fits everybody, and there just rarely is.
Yeah, yeah, I've come to realize that. Okay. Well, I mean, you've answered a lot of my questions, even without having to ask. Thank you. I really admire your passion, you know. Um, but you talked about your experiences. Well, you mentioned that you were also in the Zen tradition, right?
Yeah, I studied with some Zen people too.
Okay. So, which did you like better, the Trappist tradition or the Zen tradition?
It's not a matter of liking one better. I mean, I think they both were aspects of my path, and they assisted me and they offered me different things. Um, so that's why I was attracted to them. I mean, I think in a lot of ways, I've always been a bit of a spiritual pragmatist. It's like if it works, then use that, and if it helps bring you
Ah.
closer to a sense of God, or it somehow helps you, assists you,
Hmm.
then try to do that.
And you've also spent some time in France, right?
Yes, I was in a monastery in France for a while, a couple times, different places. The community I was in for the last part of my monastic life was a French community, and I
Do you
was
speak
both in
French?
France.
Do you speak
Yes,
French then? Oh, nice.
not well, but
So, what was that like?
it was like any kind of life. I mean, France is a place where people live, and wherever people live, they're amazingly similar. There's different cultures, there's different ways of looking at things sometimes, and yet the basic human experience is pretty similar.
Hmm.
No matter where you go, there's different words, different languages, different customs, and
Hmm.
yet the basic human experience is really quite the same.
Hmm.
Most human beings looking for meaning, for love, for a sense of significance to their life.
Hmm. Well, I heard that in France that the feminine aspect of God is a little more celebrated there. Is that? Did you find that as well?
What now?
I heard that in France that they celebrate the feminine aspect of God. Like they believe in Saint Sarah and Mary Magdalene.
Well, I don't know what to say to that. I mean, maybe that's not a traditional sort of a Catholic idea. I mean, there's always been devotion to the Virgin Mary, which I think is a sort of symbol of the feminine aspect of divinity.
Hmm.
Uh, but there's no goddesses in the Western Christian tradition. But there are images, feminine. There are feminine images of God in the Old Testament, things like that. I wouldn't say France is particularly a place where what'd you say? Saint who? Saint Sarah? I didn't hear what you
Yeah,
said.
yes, there's a Sarah, like they, at least in the south of France, they actually have like they celebrate, it's like actually like a holiday. Um,
I don't know
that,
a thing about that.
yeah, yeah, like they,
Mary Magdalene was there's a tradition, kind of a legend that Mary Magdalene lived a life in the south of France in a cave, like a
right.
hermit.
Hmm.
There's a tradition or a kind of legend about that. Whether that's historically true is pretty doubtful, actually. But I mean, there's a legend of that,
Hmm.
and then there's also legends associated with various sects and things that Mary Magdalene was the lover or the wife of Jesus and things like that. But I mean, those are very those aren't mainstream things. I mean, they maybe exist here and there, and but I
Hmm.
wouldn't say they're particularly prevalent in France. At least in the France that I know,
I see.
I didn't run
Right.
across a lot of ideas like that.
I see. Okay. All right. Well, we have a few minutes left, and so would you
Oh,
like
it went
to?
seemed like it went really quick.
I know.
Been an hour?
Almost. Yeah.
Oh.
Just about. So, but I'd like to give you an opportunity to share anything else that you'd like.
Well, I guess what I essentially share, as I say, is to really point to this reality of presence that we all are, and hopefully the most effective way I point to it is by living in it, by embodying it, and I really um, have that as my experience in life, and I hope that I can share that with the world. I mean, that's kind of the reason I'm sharing it all. The reason I go around and give retreats. The reason I talk to people on Skype or in person and try to help them
Mm-hmm.
to understand who they are already, who they always have been. Um, because after having realized that myself, I know how transformative that is, how it really, really brings our life into focus and into a kind of proper focus. And
Mm-hmm.
when we know then what our purpose in life is, and it that to be this presence, to embody this presence, to live this presence in ordinary day-to-day life, not on some cave, on some mountaintop in a cave somewhere necessarily, although that might be what somebody does, that's fine too. But most of us have to live in the day-to-day world. But to bring this sense of presence, this sense of abiding consciousness of God into our everyday lives. And I mean, that's, I guess, if I had to say what I want to be about in my life and what I hope to be about, is that. So,
Well, I personally find it fascinating that you were just a couple years ago, a monk, and were you living like at a retreat center or a monastery?
we had the monastery I was living in near the end of that time was in Montreal, and it was in an urban monastery.
Oh,
Just
wow.
it wasn't a
Okay.
big. I lived also in monasteries several times that were off in the country with many more brothers, and the one in Montreal was smaller, urban,
Mm-hmm.
and we were involved in the world. We went out and worked in the world. I
Oh,
worked in a parish and did sort of a spiritual ministry to people and things, and
mm-hmm.
with the elderly and the dying and things like that.
Yeah, actually, I've had some experience with the Vedanta tradition. Have you heard of it?
Vedanta.
Vedanta, yeah. And
Oh, sure.
they were sort of like that, Catholic
Oh,
monks, like they were spiritual scholars.
I mean
And
they were monks like sannyasi Hindu.
yeah, they're Hindu monks, but they were like in Providence. I actually spent some time in Providence, about 5 years actually. So I am familiar with the Providence Zen Center, but also they had a Vedanta center there, and yeah, they would live in,
Oh, probably it was
yeah,
Ramakrishna
yeah,
or
Ramakrishna. They were monks, and yeah, but they actually lived there and they taught there. They
right.
also, did things like you would have done, counseled families and things like that as well.
Yeah.
So I found that really, really interesting. Very similar to the Catholic tradition.
Yeah, sure. Monks are monks. No
Yeah.
matter what color robes they wear or
Hmm.
yeah, they're basically about searching for a sacred dimension to life, and if you want to call it God, whatever you call it in different traditions. But yeah, monks are all about just centering their whole life on that. That's what they propose to do. So
Mhm.
even the monks of different traditions always have a little bit of a common ground, I would say.
Mhm.
When I was in the Christian monastic life, I actually witnessed some like a lot of religious dialogue between monks of different traditions, and it was always very rich and really helpful and really an interesting sharing and of similarities and differences both. So.
Really? Yeah. Well, they're always. I remember when I was at the Buddhist Society, they would actually bring in outside um, people to speak.
Mm.
So that might be an avenue if you're interested. You know,
Oh, sure, I'll go
to
anywhere people ask
explore,
me.
to explore. Yeah, and there are Vedanta centers all over the country.
Yeah, I know. I've met some Ramakrishna monks over the years. I'm familiar with them a little bit.
Mm-hmm. It's great. Okay. Well, I had a couple other questions for you, but I'm not remembering. But on a personal note, my dad is, I don't know, the doctor mentioned hospice care. He's been really ill, so any, tips or guidance for me, we might have to even get like a hospital chaplain. If you have any words of wisdom or guidance, I'd really appreciate it on a personal note.
I would say just love him and just be with him and be present to him and be with him on his journey. He's still living. He's still on a living journey. He just we're all really on that same journey whether we know it or not. So I
Yeah.
would say just try to be present to him as much as you can
Mm-hmm.
and enjoy him and let him enjoy you and
Mm-hmm.
that'll be a great gift for him
Mm-hmm.
and for you too.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so your website is called findinggraceatthecenter.com.
Yep. Findinggraceatthecenter.com. I'm
Mm-hmm.
on Facebook. People can connect to me there.
And what's your
And
name on Facebook? Is it Francis Bennett?
Francis Bennett. It's really the official name is Francis Dale Bennett. It says Francis Bennett on the page, but Francis Dale Bennett is the official name, the Facebook name. So
Okay.
Columbus, Ohio. There's other Francis Bennett. So,
Okay,
but
so
my
Francis.
picture comes up, so you can, they see me here, they'll see the picture, they'll recognize me probably. And it's Columbus, Ohio. I think usually they have your city or something underneath it.
Yes. Uh-huh. So findinggraceatthecenter.com is your website. Your book is called I Am That
I
I
Am
Am.
That I
I Am
Am
That I
by
Am.
Non-Duality Press. You can either order it
Mhm.
at my website, which links you to Non-Duality Press. You can get it on Amazon.com. Put in the search for Francis Bennett, I Am That I Am, and it'll come up and you can order. It's about $12, I think, on Amazon, and cheaper a little, I think, on I'm not positive. It's about the same price. Non-Duality Press, and like I say, you can get that from a link from my website, or you can go right to Non-Duality Press. Google them and go to their website. They have a lot of other books that are very wonderful sharings of this similar stuff. It's called Non-Duality Press, so it's all non-dual spirituality. Jeff Foster is one person that publishes with them. They have some books out by the French Jean Klein. They had published some books by him and other various Rupert Spira, other various teachers. So they have a wide variety, very very nice selection.
Okay. And will you be teaching anywhere or touring anywhere?
Yeah, I'm going to be doing a lot in between now and September, and there's details about all those things on my website or on my Facebook. The most recent thing I have is at the end of the month, I'm going to be going to North Carolina, to Raleigh and Chapel Hill, North Carolina. I'm going to be going to Miami later in the year. I just got back from Texas. I'm going to be going to Costa Rica. I'm going to be going to Pittsburgh, so New York, um, California in the fall.
Oh, really? Whereabouts in California?
Well, I'm going to be going to the SAND conference in California. It's like usually in the Bay Area.
Oh,
I'm not positive.
that's where I am.
Oh, uh-huh. Well,
Yeah.
maybe we'll
So
meet. Did you go to SAND before?
I haven't.
Oh,
I haven't even
oh,
heard of it. What exactly
you
is
could
that?
interview. It's called Science and Non-Duality. It's a big conference that happens in the Bay Area every year in
Oh,
the
wow.
fall for the
Okay.
last, I think, 6, 7 years.
Oh,
And
wow.
you a lot of people there you could interview.
Oh, nice. That might be a good thing. I actually just moved out here just like less than a year ago from Fairfield,
Oh, I'm going to go
Fairfield,
to
Iowa.
in May. I'm going to Fairfield and do a retreat there.
Oh, nice.
Yeah,
Okay, well, I'm due for a visit there, so who knows? I might see you.
yeah, maybe.
But wonderful. Okay, any final thoughts?
No, just
Okay. Well,
happy to
thanks.
be here. I'm glad you invited me, and I hope your work goes well and helps many people. That's my final thought.
Ah, thank you. Thank you so much. I'm really enjoying doing this, and it was a pleasure to talk to you. I learned a lot, and I'll remember to stay present. And
You are
I'll
what, whether you remember or not, you're present. You just need to kind of
accept it,
wake up to it.
wake
Yeah,
up to it, accept it.
yeah.
Okay. And I'll
All
remember
right.
what you said about for my dad. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
All right. Now,
I'll keep him in my prayers.
thank you. Thank you. Namaste.
Bye. Namaste to you.